everybody. Good morning. Welcome to the fourth and final day of the American Dream Reconsidered Conference. My name is Margaret Rung, and I'm a professor of history here at Roosevelt and director of the Center for New Deal Studies. Along with Professor Andy Trees, I'm also co-chair of this year's ADRC. This year we're celebrating the 80th anniversary of the founding of Roosevelt University with sessions that honor the legacy of Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. Our final panel also serves as the 32nd Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt Distinguished Program sponsored by the Center for New Deal Studies. Each year the center organizes a lecture or a program that considers the values and the vision of the Roosevelts, and this year's panel, entitled America and the World, from the creation of the United Nations and NATO to the America First agenda, could not be more fitting for a program named after the Roosevelts. As we will learn more about, the United Nations was largely the vision of Franklin D. Roosevelt as he saw the nation through a devastating world war, and Eleanor Roosevelt was instrumental in seeing that vision to fruition. I want to thank all those who helped make this conference happen: Katura Brown, Amanda DePalma, Mike Kaluzny, Angela Short, Harold Wexler, Michael Ford, Jared Fritz McCarty, and our technical team, including Marge Schultz. Thank you so much. It gives me great pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Dr. Ian Hurd, who will then introduce our panelists. A professor of political science and president of the Faculty Senate at Northwestern University, Dr. Hurd also directs Northwestern's International Studies program. A specialist on international law and politics, including the United Nations, Dr. Hurd is the author of numerous publications, including a well-known textbook, International Organizations, Politics, Law, Practice, which is in its 5th edition. He has been a visiting scholar at the American Bar Foundation, the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, and a number of other prestigious institutions. I will note that anyone who understands academic governance knows how much work goes into serving as head of a faculty senate, especially in these challenging times. It's probably not quite as difficult as directing the UN, but a close second, really. And recently, the Northwestern University Faculty Senate overwhelmingly passed a resolution indicating its opposition to signing on to the Trump administration's Compact for Academic Excellence in Higher Education. So thank you, Professor Hurd, for your service and commitment to academic freedom. Now, on to a freewheeling, uncensored discussion of the United Nations in the best spirit of open academic discourse. Professor Hurd?
Well, thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm glad to see you all here. I'm looking forward to the conversation. Thanks to all the organizers, too. It's a thrill to be here on stage with these two. I'll introduce them and then let them start telling their stories, and then we can open it up to a conversation. Adam Lupel is the executive director of the Coalition for the UN We Need in New York. He has a PhD from the New School in New York, and a long career in the kind of thoughtful domain of para-UN institutions. That is the kind of intellectual and practical work that tries to steer UN agencies and the environment in which they operate towards better outcomes. He's certainly the person that you want to talk to if you want to know what's going on today behind the scenes in international conflict around the halls in New York and Geneva. And despite knowing so much about these things, he manages to be a rather cheerful fellow at the same time, so that's super cool. And David Woolner is a professor of history at Marist College and a widely published scholar on the Roosevelts, on American progressivism, on international and American history of the 20th century. He has bookshelves worth of work that you can refer back to get the details of these broad 20th century waves of politics and activism that have constituted the world that we're talking about. He's the person you want to talk to if you want to know what FDR had for breakfast on February 12th, 1945. So between the two, I think we're really lucky to have all the bases covered, right? We can find out about the historical context and the development of the international political arena over decades and bring it into the present to get a clear sense of what's going on with these machines today and where are we going. So it's my pleasure to be here with you all. I'll begin by turning it over to Professor Woolner to talk a little bit about the history of the Roosevelts in the UN.
It works. Well, I assume we're speaking from the chair, so I'll remain seated. Is that
Microphone.
Oh, that's all right. Sorry. All right, sorry about that. First, I want to thank Dr. Rung for the invitation to be here today, Center for New Deal Studies, and of course, Roosevelt University. It's great to be back. I was here, we were chatting, I think, either 2018 or 2019, but it's wonderful to be back. I'm just going to try to do this quickly, a little talk about the sort of vision that Roosevelt had for the world. And I'm going to begin by reminding everybody that he was president through the two great crises of the 20th century. Of course, the Great Depression, for those of you who don't know, that's a slide of Central Park in 1932. And of course, he was president during the Second World War. This slide I tried to put together because there is this period when the war breaks out in 1939. The United States, of course, was a neutral power. And we were able to eventually start helping the British and the French in their opposition to the Nazis through a program called cash and carry. So we remained neutral, but there was an amendment to the neutrality law that allowed the Allies to purchase American goods, American weapons, et cetera, on a cash and carry basis. Nevertheless, this created a huge debate in the United States between people who called themselves isolationists versus those who were in favor of aid to Britain. And there was a great deal of fear among the isolationists that Roosevelt was going to drag the nation into war. So this went on for a good year and a half, 2 years. And at the end of 1940, after France had fallen, the British government found out it was broke. They no longer could afford to buy anything from the United States, and Winston Churchill wrote a pleading letter to Roosevelt that he received in December 10th, 1940, saying to Roosevelt that the United States, or that Great Britain would not be able to continue the war if the United States didn't offer some kind of assistance. They didn't have any more money to purchase things, plus they were losing all kinds of ships in the Atlantic. And actually, isolationists were not opposed to the United States building up its arms. They just didn't want to send them to Britain. They wanted to create what was called Fortress America. So the United States had been building up its defense capabilities throughout this period. And this was a kind of typical scene that Americans might see in the newspaper or newsreels of the Blitz in the fall of 1940 when Germany was bombing London. Roosevelt gave a press conference on December 17th, and he started reflecting on the state of the war. And he said, you know, if you think about it, Britain's defense is our defense, and since we're building up our defense capability, maybe we should just give them some of the stuff and take the silly old dollar sign out of the equation. And then he gave that famous analogy. He said, you know, if your neighbor's house is on fire and he wants to come over and borrow a garden hose, you're going to loan him the hose. You're not going to say, well, you're going to pay for it. And he said, in the same sort of spirit, we should do the same to help Britain. And then in this very wonderful fireside chat near the end of December, in that great voice of his, he went on the radio and said, we must become the great arsenal of democracy, which I think is a brilliant phrase. And he made the case for providing Britain with the aid it needed to carry on the war, and he established a program that was known as Lend-Lease. And Lend-Lease was a program by which the United States would lend or lease war material, goods, steel, other things to any nation that the President of the United States, whose defense the President of the United States deemed was vital to the defense of the United States. So this was the beginning. And then on January 6, 1941, he gave his State of the Union address. And he went on, this is going to cost money, obviously. The Congress was going to have to appropriate funds for this. And he explained what the Lend-Lease program was and how the American people and the American Congress should support it. And then near the end of the speech, he kind of raised a hypothetical question, why should we do this? And he answered by saying, in future days, which we seek to make secure, we look forward to a world founded on 4 fundamental human freedoms. And then again, in that great voice, the first is freedom of speech and expression everywhere in the world. And then the second line, which is my favorite. The second, the freedom of every person to worship God in their own way everywhere in the world. Everywhere in the world. Now, Americans are used to this. We're used to freedom of speech. We're used to freedom of worship. It's in our Constitution. But then he went on. He said freedom from want, right? Freedom from destitution, freedom from poverty, everywhere in the world. And finally, freedom from fear, so that no nation should fear an act of physical aggression by any neighbor anywhere in the world. Well, this is a huge expansion of US foreign policy, enormous expansion. So he has to convince the American people to support it. And 8 months later, he met with Churchill and the Atlantic Charter. This idea of the 4 freedoms was kind of further articulated. You can see here, there they are meeting off the coast of Newfoundland. And you notice securing for all, improved labor standards, economic advancement, and social security, all right? The New Deal for the world. And then the last clause talks about the creation of an international security organization once the war was over, and this is widely regarded as the birth of the United Nations. So still, there's a war to be won. We obviously got in on December 7th. Winston Churchill invited himself to the White House. And during that encounter, which was quite a colorful encounter, Roosevelt and Churchill came up with this idea that they should ask all the nations of the world that were willing to do it to sign some sort of pledge, committing themselves not to sign a separate peace with the Axis, not to do anything to help the Axis powers, not a declaration of war, but a pledge committing themselves to a similar position. And famously, Roosevelt, they were searching for a name, and this is when Roosevelt wheeled himself into the White House bathroom. Churchill staying in the White House, and he was taking a bath, and he was dictating a speech to his secretary, his male secretary, quite upset at the speech he was giving, and got out of the bath with the towels wrapped around and kept on pacing and lost all his towels and ended up stark naked, right when Franklin Roosevelt wheeled himself into the bathroom to tell him he'd come up with the name. And Churchill, was standing there naked, and Roosevelt apologized and started to wheel himself out in his wheelchair. And Churchill famously said, "It's all right, Mr. President. As you can see, the leader of His Majesty's government has nothing to hide from the President of the United States." That's a true story. I've actually seen the documents. So what was the name? The name was the United Nations. And the idea was that they would invite everybody to Washington, to the White House that was willing to sign it, to sign this declaration by the United Nations. And I love this document from the Roosevelt Presidential Library. Originally, they thought they would have the big 4 at the top, the United States, China, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, and then Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And then you can see how Churchill wanted the dominions listed underneath. And here, in a nod to Roosevelt's complete disgust of colonialism, he took out a pencil and said, "No way," and he put the dominions down in alphabetical order. And he also added India, by the way, which was not a dominion at this point. So this is the name of the alliance that fought World War II. We tend to forget that, but it was called United Nations Forces did this, United Nations Forces did that. However, Roosevelt was always afraid that isolationism would come back, and so he had to figure out a way to commit the United States to this American people to this very expanded vision of American foreign policy. And of course, what better way to do it than to go on the radio and give another fireside chat. So this is about 2 months after Pearl Harbor. And he actually asked the American people to buy maps, to go out and buy world maps. And it was the largest sale of National Geographic world maps in history. Remember, we don't have any television to speak of at this point. And then he went on the radio and he said, "Now take out your maps." And he said, "World War II is a new kind of war. not only in its methods and its technology, but also in its geography. It is warfare on every continent, every island, every sea lane, and most importantly, every air lane in the world. Now, most Americans think of the United States like this, right? An equatorial map where we look very safe between the Atlantic and the Pacific Oceans. But Roosevelt also had this map produced. He had a cartographer, a man named Harris, who did a lot of maps for Roosevelt. And this is a polar projection map. And when you look at the world from this perspective, the United States is actually not that far from the Eurasian continent where the war is going on. And then you add the advent of air power, and all of a sudden, it gets really scary when you start thinking about that. So it comes as no surprise to me then that the symbol of the United Nations is a polar projection map. Now the other thing, and I usually talk about Roosevelt having to come, pursuing three goals near the end of his life. I wrote a book about the end of his life. And the first was creating the structures of peace, which would be the United Nations and so forth. The second is doing away with American isolationism, which we've just talked about. And the third was great power cooperation. He had to maintain great power cooperation between the Soviet Union, Britain, and the United States and the other powers. So here he is, looking very happy at Tehran in 1943, his first meeting with Stalin at the end of November, beginning of December 1943. And at that meeting, he purposely met privately with Stalin on a number of occasions, and he drew this up and showed this to Stalin, his map of the United Nations, his structure of the United Nations. And if you can see it on the left, there's a circle which says 40 UN, that's the General Assembly. And then very interesting, underneath, he's written ILO, International Labor Organization, Health, World Health Program, Agriculture, Food, World Food Program, and so forth, representing the sort of ECOSOC chamber. The center, the Secretariat, the Secretary General's office, and then, of course, on the right, the four policemen, the Security Council. And he actually signed it by FDR at Tehran, November 30th, 1943, and he kept it. This was his introduction. By the way, November 30th, 1943 was Churchill's birthday. In any case, we won't get into the details of the negotiations that led to the creation of the UN, but it was at the Yalta Conference that the final difficulties were overcome. This was on the voting procedure in the United Nations Security Council, which, as you know, it was a kind of compromise whereby the permanent members could not stop an issue from being discussed, even if that issue was embarrassing to them, but they could veto action if an action was called for. And this, by the way, was widely seen as a concession to the Soviets, but it also was very much part of Roosevelt's concern about the US Senate ratifying the Charter of the United Nations. He had lived through the League of Nations debate and felt that this would strengthen the ability of the United States to become a member. And then, of course, at Yalta, he had very, very much insisted that they had to have this April 16th meeting in San Francisco to really launch the UN, and he was very much looking forward to that. But of course, sadly, he was not able to do so because he died on the 12th of April, 1945, of a massive cerebral hemorrhage. Here he is working on the Jefferson Day address, and it's very interesting to look at that address. He talked about, he was going to give this talk on the radio celebrating Jefferson's birthday, as he did every year. And he reflected on Jefferson being a scientist, and he talked about Jefferson espousing the brotherly spirit of science that had brought into one family, however, various votaries, however dispersed around the world. And he thought there was a lesson in that observation, because today we are faced with the preeminent fact that if civilization is to survive, we must cultivate the science of human relationships, the ability of all peoples, of all kinds, to live together and work together in the same world at peace. That is almost virtually the last words that Franklin Roosevelt wrote. He died the next day. And of course, it's a fitting tribute to the institution that carried forward in New York, the United Nations. So thank you very much.
Thank you, David. So David has outlined what I take to be kind of the vision of the early United Nations, which then gets encoded into the text of the Charter. And what we deal with today is that text as it has been turned into practice over the decades. So Adam, perhaps I'll turn to you and ask, from your view in practice today, how does that original vision and that text seem to be reflected in the things that you see going on?
Amazing. Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I've got a response to that question, but first I just want to make one or two comments on that really interesting presentation. One is what struck me about here. You know, so I work, as Ian said, around the United Nations, mostly in the nonprofit think tank world, and usually often the audience that I'm speaking to is not Americans, it's international. And one of the things that struck me about this presentation is, even though I knew, right, the UN was a US project, what is fascinating is that, I mean, FDR campaigned for the UN. He brought the American public along on that journey, and that's completely absent today. You know, you don't see that really, notwithstanding the efforts of the UN Foundation in DC and such. And the other thing is this point about isolationism that you said, and the projection of the map. Based upon the advent of air power, we couldn't be, I mean, think about that today. I mean, there are so many more reasons why the US cannot be isolated from the issues of the world, not least of which, you know, missile technology and nuclear weapons and such, but what Kofi Annan called the problems without passports. So many issues that we address today cross borders easily, and the US can't remain isolated, and thus some kind of international organization is needed. How is the UN? How is the UN today? So yeah, so I have been observing the UN for some 20 years closely, and the UN is in some ways felt a bit in crisis that whole time, but right now it feels a bit different. So as you may know, every September, a new session of the UN General Assembly begins. This is the 80th session presently. We're 80 years old. And at the start of the 80th General Assembly just last month in September, there was a lot of conversation and people saying that the institution felt like it was in free fall. And that is a quote. This is in part due to long-standing issues, like the frustration of many in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, that the UN reflects that still post-World War II transatlantic order that David kind of described, and not the world today. It's interesting, some of those pictures, right? It's a lot of white men. That's not how the world really looks today. In 1945, there was, at the San Francisco conference for the Charter, it was it 53 countries? Now there's 50, so I forget exactly. Now there's 193 members of the United Nations. But as well, that crisis comes from a recognition that the UN has failed many people around the world at its most fundamental purpose, and that is to, quote the Charter, save succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Conflicts with dire consequences for civilians have seemed out of control for quite some time, in particular in recent years, in Ukraine, in Gaza, in Sudan. Whether or not we call Haiti a conflict or not, civilians are bearing the brunt of the violence. Just to name a few, there are others. And this is supposed to be the fundamental purpose of the United Nations, is to prevent conflict, maintain international peace and security. But also on a little bit more wonky side, it is because of extreme budgetary challenges that the organization is facing. In part, we're talking about the US here, in part due to the lack of payments by the United States, and also sort of paying their dues late. The US is the largest funder of the United Nations. Actually, on Friday, October 17th, the Secretary General, in briefing a budgetary committee at the UN, said the institution is actually on a race to bankruptcy. So it's really quite serious. But I wanted to say a few things. I think for the purposes of our conversation, I want to be clear about what we are talking about when we talk about the UN. It doesn't, the UN architecture doesn't fit on a nice little notepad anymore as it did when FDR sketched it out. It's extremely complex. And so when we ask how is the UN doing and is the UN still of value, it is important to ask what aspect of the UN are we speaking about? The UN is not anymore, if it ever was, a single hierarchical institution that speaks with one voice or moves with one purpose. It is a vast system with 5 active, independent principal organs of the Charter, and that includes the Security Council, which was mentioned, the General Assembly, and the Secretariat, which is led by the Secretary General and staffed with civil servants from around the world. But it also includes a vast array of specialized agencies and programs and actors with a variety of levels of independence that have developed over the last 80 years. And that's where if you get try to get a granogram of the United Nations, it gets really complicated with the arrows pointing all over the place. But it is, in assessing the UN, it is critically important to remember and to understand that it remains an intergovernmental organization. It is a body made up of member states, of national governments, like the United States, or Russia, or China, or any number of those 193 countries of the world, which is pretty much every country in the world. And all of those 193 countries do contribute financially to be a voting member of the General Assembly. I was recently in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia and Herzegovina, where there was a war 30 years ago that the UN played a critical part in, with somewhat mixed results. And I was reminded when I was there of the sort of giant of American diplomacy, Richard Holbrooke, who was the architect of the Dayton Peace Accords that ended that war 30 years ago. He said, you know, blaming the United Nations when things go wrong in the world is like blaming Madison Square Garden when the Knicks lose, or blaming the United Center when the Bulls lose, if we want to make it local. That is to say that the UN is an arena where geopolitics are played out, and it rises and falls based upon the players, based upon the member states, based upon the actions of the governments that form its principal bodies, like the Security Council or the General Assembly. And the issue today is that so many of those governments, including those very powerful ones that used to be the guarantors of the system that you saw in those photos, like the US and Russia, are behaving so badly that are working in sort of against the institutional interests of the United Nations, that people are starting to say perhaps this stadium, this arena, after 80 years is more worse for wear and needs to be fundamentally remodeled. And the reform conversation is very robust right now around the UN. A couple points on that. So the question about the form, everybody, it's a broad consensus view, even people who support the UN vigorously, like myself, and those that are real critics agree, reform is needed. But the question is this a simple matter of reform, or in some quarters, is it time to kind of give up on the organization as it exists right now and kind of start over? Does the UN as it exists today still hold value? Washington seems a little bit on the fence. And I would argue, just to full disclosure and to frame our conversation, I believe, yes, it very much does still hold value. We can simply not give up on it in its entirety. A world without the UN as it exists today would be poorer, sicker, and more violent. Just for a moment, imagine a world without the United Nations. Many people don't realize this, but you couldn't safely get on a plane without the United Nations because the International Civil Aviation Organization wouldn't exist. That's part of the United Nations. Millions of children wouldn't get vaccinated every year because UNICEF wouldn't exist. Last year, UNICEF supplied vaccines to 45% of the world's children. Over 130 million refugees would lose their support, and you might ask where they would go if they don't have the support in the regions what they do now. And over 120 million people in over 120 countries would lose their food assistance without the UN's World Food Program, which maybe to Trump's chagrin actually is a Nobel Peace Laureate, the World Food Program. Girls' education. Notwithstanding the origins of the UN, gender equality is a major program at the United Nations. Girls' education would certainly decline across the world without the multiple UN agencies that work concretely on the advancement of women's rights. Nuclear weapons would likely proliferate without the monitoring capacity of the IAEA, another United Nations agency. Climate change would accelerate without the COP process, which is ongoing. There's a new round happening in Brazil in a few weeks. The list really goes on and on. But one thing based upon the sort of the principal, fundamental purpose of the United Nations. Consider this, without the United Nations, the only universal intergovernmental organization dedicated to maintaining international peace and security in the world, without the United Nations, there would be no place where all the governments of the world could come together to talk to each other on a daily basis, to harmonize action towards common ends. It's often leveled as a criticism of the UN. Oh, it's just a talk shop. That's called diplomacy, actually. Talking is important. It is incredibly important for governments to have that space to come together, to manage their competition peacefully, to build trust, to diffuse tensions. And I think, indeed, one can argue that is one of the biggest reasons why the Cold War didn't lead to another world war. That's really the fundamental core purpose for the United Nations, is to avoid that world war. That's what was front and center in Roosevelt's mind, I believe. If you think the world is divided today, filled with mistrust today, it would be gravely worse without that regular universal diplomatic channel. You can be certain. So we can talk a little bit more specifically about things, but I would just say, yes, the UN has problems. It needs to be reformed, it needs to change, but what we need that change to lead to a revitalized international cooperation, revitalized United Nations, and not a diminished one, which some actors are advocating for.
Thank you so much. So interesting. David, can I send it back to you and just I'm wondering if you could reanimate Roosevelt. What would he think of Adams' report?
Well, first of all, he would totally agree. One of the things that was interesting about writing The Last 100 Days was this focus on the last few months of his life. And one speech that he gave that never gets quoted very much is his last State of the Union address, which comes right before Yalta. And he's almost warning the American people about the difficulties ahead, because there were lots of reports in the press about Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, but also British imperialism. We tend to forget that was just as controversial at the end of the war as Russian moves in Poland and elsewhere. And so reflecting on that, Roosevelt said in this speech, in our disillusion after the last war, we preferred international anarchy to international cooperation with nations which did not see and think exactly as we did. We gave up the hope of gradually achieving a better peace because we had not the courage to fulfill our responsibilities in an admittedly imperfect world. We must not let that happen again, he said, or we should go down the same tragic road again, the road to a third world war. So there it is. I mean, he would emphatically endorse what you just said. I forgot also to mention when I had the slide up of the Great Depression, the one point that I always try to make when talking about Roosevelt's vision for the future is that for the generation that fought World War II, the Great Depression and World War II were intimately linked. It was the Great Depression, which was a global economic crisis, not confined to the United States, which gave rise to the anti-democratic ideologies like Nazism in Germany and elsewhere. So, you know, his point to the American people in all those speeches that he made over and over again about American security was the fact, essentially, that the well-being of the American people and security of the American people, well-being and security, was intimately tied to the well-being of people around the world. And so you had to promote freedom from want if you wanted to prevent the outbreak of another Third World War. In January, a year before this, in January 1944 State of the Union address, he called for an economic Bill of Rights because he said, we've come to the clear realization of the fact that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. Necessitous men are not free men. People who are hungry and out of the job are the stuff with which dictatorships are made. So, you know, I think he would be quite happy actually to listen to you this morning, and because, you know, in spite of all the imperfections, and in spite of all the frustration, all that great work that's happening in the area of food security, vaccines, science, climate change, everything else, he would certainly champion. And so, of course, would Eleanor Roosevelt, whom we haven't mentioned yet, but of course she's the one who steered through the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is very Rooseveltian in many respects. You know, much of what Roosevelt tried to do was aspirational. We tend to think of it as, well, it didn't work, you know, but you know, what he's doing is setting the bar. And that's what he did at Yalta with the Declaration of Liberated Europe, with the Declaration on Poland. This is what we expect. This is the standard we want to achieve. And he's speaking not just to the American people, he's speaking to people around the world, which is why I think, you know, let's not forget that the trusteeship council disappeared, right, in the 1990s because there were no colonies left. And that was another great mission that he wanted to achieve. So there's much in what you said that I think he would deeply appreciate.
I wonder if I could have you both say a little more about how you see the U.S. position at the moment. Does it look to you like the UN is operating kind of with the U.S. just absent, like not playing along, not being constructive, not contributing its money? Or are there corners where the U.S. continues to participate? And I guess as a subsidiary to that, is its participation malevolent or constructive?
Yes, it is. It remains engaged at the UN, but in a way that would appear to be following a vision of interest, of national interest, that kind of goes against the Roosevelt vision of interest. That is to say, Trump, as we all know, is very transactional, and so he thinks with every decision, what's in it for us. So as a result, the U.S. is withdrawing from some organizations, the Human Rights Council. It's started the process to withdraw from the World Health Organization, UNESCO. All of which, in my mind, is misunderstanding what U.S. national interest would be from a Roosevelt perspective. I mean, it's important to understand that the United Nations multilateralism is not set in opposition to national interest. The idea is that it's a system for all countries of the world to be able to pursue their own national interests collectively, because in a world in 1945, but even more so today, we need to, because we can't be isolated. It gets back to that isolated point. But yes, the U.S. remains engaged. For example, last month, it drove forward the resolution on Haiti that will support a gang suppression force in Haiti. The U.S. co-sponsored that resolution and co-drafted it. So there's still areas where the United States, is picking and choosing its engagement. But then, is that malevolent? I mean, I wouldn't use the word malevolent, but at times it is oppositional. That is, the U.S. is increasingly in negotiations of various resolutions and budgetary matters, putting forth oppositional views to major agenda items that everyone thought were agreed upon, settled issues. For example, what is known as the Sustainable Development Goals, the UN's agenda for development for the world that was established in 2015 for policies up to 2030. This was sort of settled, and the U.S. is now calling attention to it in all resolutions, saying we don't want that. Issues related to gender equality, climate, as you know, in Trump's speech in September, he called climate a con job. And what is happening then is in negotiations, there's something that some have called Control-Alt-Delete diplomacy, where U.S. diplomats are just sort of taking a document and just searching out certain words. I think there's actually like a list. It's kind of the UN version of the anti-DEI, anti-woke thing, and just striking it. And these are often agreed upon language that really is quite oppositional to the whole agenda. So it's a bit of a pick and choose. But I do think that the U.S. will remain engaged in some way because there are mechanisms within the United Nations for the U.S., who has a privileged place at the United Nations because of its veto and such. The U.S. will continue to see that as useful in some way.
I would just add that if there is a positive to come out of this negative push, shall we say, it has had the impact, for example, the easiest example to come up with is the impact on President Trump's attitude towards NATO and Western European defense, how the European nations have taken a much greater responsibility for their own defense and spending additional money and so forth and so on. I think the rest of the world is kind of waking up to the fact that they can't rely on the United States and is going to have to look for other avenues to support the programs that Adam mentioned earlier. And that might ultimately be a good thing. I should say that unfortunately most Americans don't realize that the United States gives less than 1% of its budget towards foreign aid. They have this idea that we're spending huge amounts of money. And actually per capita, we are not the strongest foreign aid donor in the world. Other countries exceed us on a per capita basis. The only other thing I would say is that, and this is on the political realm, what's interesting to me is that the multilateralism that Adam mentioned also has its roots in the New Deal and in the Roosevelt period, because in 1934, to be a historian for a second, the Secretary of State, his name was Cordell Hull, was very much a believer in free trade, and he wanted to reduce tariffs because tariffs were, on his mind, a tax on the poor, and replace tariffs with a progressive income tax. That had been his position all the way through his professional life as a government official and as a senator and congressman. And so when he became Secretary of State, he passed this law called the Reciprocal Trade Agreements Act, which meant that if Ian and I signed an agreement together, and he was Costa Rica and I was United States, and I lowered the import duties on coffee, and and he lowered the import duties on New York apples or whatever, that would be a bilateral trade agreement. But under the terms of that Reciprocal Trade Act, every agreement that was signed between two countries was instantly multilateralized for any country that belonged to what was called the Most Favored Nation Club. Every single trade agreement actually increased trade agreements around the world, and Hull's goal was to lower tariffs. So it gave the president the authority to raise or lower tariffs by 50%. But of course, Hull's goal was to lower them. And basically what they did in 1947 is they just all got together in Switzerland and signed hundreds of trade agreements, and that became the General Agreement on Tariff and Trade, which lasted up until the early 1990s when this kind of free market fundamentalism took over, and we have a much, under GATT, countries could protect sort of key industries, right? But under the new regime, it was a much more open system. And the result was, of course, a lot of manufacturing jobs leaving Western Europe and the United States for Asia, which I think is a good deal of the origin, a lot of the source of frustration, which has led to this kind of populism that we see in Europe and the United States in the last couple of decades. So there are historical antecedents here. My big question for myself is whether the tariffs are going to have the opposite effect, that if people are going to realize that this is a negative. But again, we don't know yet. It may take some time. So he's more than just rhetorically upending things. He's also returning to a kind of 19th century economic theory, which is, he insists is going to work, but a lot of economists are very skeptical about, so we'll see.
I wonder if we could step outside the U.S. for a bit, and if I could ask you to think a little about how this looks from elsewhere. I grew up in Canada, and so I learned my international organization undergraduate education in a Canadian university, where the standard theme was all these big institutions like the UN were overly dominated by the US, and everyone was trying to figure out how to push the Americans to stay in their lane a little bit more, right, and not be as involved everywhere around the world. And so it's a little bit bewildering to see the Americans suddenly backing off. And so I wonder what fills the void. So how do you think this looks outside the US? And I guess maybe are there ways in which other countries, you think, in the UN specifically, are taking new roles and building new things as the Americans evacuate?
Absolutely. I mean, I think bewilderment is right. I think it's fascinating to hear the emphasis that Roosevelt had on freedom from want, on economic issues, because in the debates around the UN, often with the rest of the world, what we call the global South, for lack of a better word, the developing world, Latin America, Asia, Africa, are often very singularly focused on poverty eradication, development, and they think the West is not focusing on that enough because the institution still remains dominated in a way by the US and European powers, in a way that some have said that the US over time kind of weaponized interdependence in order to keep the West in power, for lack of a better kind of phrasing. And so some are saying, well, okay, the US is withdrawing, great, good riddance. Let's rethink the system to better reflect power in the world. That it's interesting, it's important to reflect upon how things have changed. So when in Roosevelt's time in 1945, if you one of my previous sort of iterations was I led a project called the Multilateralism Index that measured aspects of the multilateral system. And one of the things we charted out was that in 1945, the members of the permanent members of the Security Council, US, Russia, China, France, Britain, if you measured their material power in terms of military expenditure, industrial power, population, on a chart, they would have been up here in 1945, and the rest of the world would have been here. Well, over time, that chart has changed. And around the mid-'80s, they crossed lines. And today, the rest of the world, in terms of material power, is here, and the P5 collectively is here. The economic and material power of the world has changed, and many people see, the U.S. It's quite bewildering because the system has benefited U.S. power so much, so they think, well, okay, maybe we can use this as an opportunity to rephrase things. Very difficult, though, because the U.S. even considering that graph, I mean, the U.S. still remains the predominant military power in the world and the largest economy and such. But things are changing. And, you know, thinking about the conversation in September around Trump's speech, and then comparing it to the speech of the Chinese later in the week, and the conversations among diplomats in these days, China, to much of the world, increasingly looks like the adult in the room, the consistent partner, the one that you can rely on. You know, it's not even so much about what the U.S. policy is, but how the U.S. policy seems to change dramatically and is kind of capricious. When the U.S. withdrew from the UN activities in his first term, it was very clear China stepped forward and started fighting for positions, becoming more engaged in things, and that trend has only continued. But it's not just a binary choice. It's not just about choosing the US or China. Countries around the world are working in kind of multi-alignment, sometimes working with the US, sometimes working with Russia, sometimes working with China, notwithstanding the US position of kind of like, you're with us or you're not without us. And things are moving along. We withdrew, the US withdrew from the pandemics treaty negotiations. And frankly, it kind of facilitated agreement on the treaty. There was a treaty just this year that was able to come together on how to respond to a new pandemic. There was an agreement in Seville in Spain early this year on development, financing for development. Also, the U.S. kind of didn't engage, and there was international agreement came about it. So countries are not waiting for the U.S. to come back engaged. They actually are sort of looking to develop new pathways and new forms of agreement as well.
I can't help, you know, again, I mentioning China, it's interesting, being the adult in the room, in January of 1945, Roosevelt was talking to his Secretary of State then, Stettinius, and Harry Hopkins, another aide, about China. And he was complaining about the British. And he said, you know, the British are trying to undermine our whole policy with regard to China. And he said, and I'm quoting him now, London still clung to the idea, quote, of white supremacy in Asia and did not want to see a strong China. But his feeling, Roosevelt's feeling, was despite temporary weakness and the possibility of revolutions and civil war, the 450 million Chinese would someday become united and modernized and would become the whole most important power in Asia. So, you know, his prescience is there. It's kind of amazing when you think about it. It is, you know, interestingly enough, we have two Canadians up here now, so I also did my graduate work in Canada as opposed to Minnesota. Minnesota might as well be Canada, so I'm kind of Canadian in more sense than one. But between the weather and hockey, you know. Yeah, if you look at a country like Canada, which is suffering tremendously under this new regime, you know, it goes back to what I was saying earlier. They're really working hard to try to seek different avenues economically to counter the tremendous damage that the tariffs are doing to Canada in particular, which is probably suffering in many ways more than any other country right now as a consequence of that transactional behavior on the part of the president, in spite of the fact that if you take away the purchase of oil and natural gas, Canada has a huge trade surplus with the United States, and in fact is the largest purchaser of goods and services from the United States, more than any other country in the world, more than China, more than European Union combined, and yet that doesn't seem to matter. It's again this sort of irrationality of some of these decisions, like you say, click, alt, delete, which boggles the mind, and it makes it very difficult to think about the future.
Thank you. I'm conscious that we haven't talked much yet about the two big military conflicts going on in the world, Israel-Palestine and Russia-Ukraine. What do you see as the UN's role, either hypothetical or real, in those areas?
I'm not an expert on, certainly on the Middle East, although Roosevelt, again, made a point of visiting Ibn Saud in 1945, which is really the beginning of a kind of American relationship with that part of the world. But, you know, I think the UN, ultimately, it's sort of by default, right? I mean, where else is the international community going to go? You know, you need a forum in which the Palestinian population can feel that it is at least being treated on an equal basis in terms of saying what it wants to say. You know, if they're strictly speaking to the Europeans or the modern Western powers, they're always going to feel as if they're being pressured to behave a certain way, even if they're in favor of trying to come to some sort of peace agreement with the United States. It's interesting when you think about the Oslo Accords, for example, going outside of the typical U.S. orbit in trying to negotiate. So I would kind of suspect that the UN would ultimately have an important role to play. On Ukraine, I think the same thing applies. I mean, that is a war that I find it very hard to understand why the United States is not more forthcoming. The current administration is not more forthcoming in trying to support the Ukrainians in what is clearly an example of international aggression on the part of the Russians. So, again, one hopes that the UN would also play a constructive role in that conflict.
Minefields, both of them, in long conversations. But one thing I think when I said in my remarks about you know, powerful countries behaving badly, Ukraine in particular has to be front and center. The invasion of Ukraine by Russia did some real profound damage to the Security Council. To have a P5 member so blatantly violate the principal purposes of the UN Charter and then use the Security Council and their veto to sort of serve up an extraordinary amount of misinformation and disinformation to the world really undermined the credibility of the institution quite dramatically. And then it wasn't helped by the U.S. use of Gaza, of its veto around Gaza to consistently use the veto to prevent resolutions around Gaza in the subsequent year. But the UN, despite the gridlock on the Security Council on these issues, has had an important role, and it's also led to some interesting innovations. So in particular on Ukraine, what has happened is, given the inability to get anything through the Security Council because of Russia's veto, that has elevated the role of the General Assembly quite dramatically. And through the creation of a special session so that it was discussed, but also through something called the Veto Initiative, which was put forward by one of the small countries, Liechtenstein, that requires a country, when they use the veto in the Security Council, to come to the General Assembly to defend their position. And so it's a fundamental, interesting change in how the UN engages with this. And so Ukraine has been a constant debate in the UN. It's occupied a tremendous amount of space around the United Nations. One thing on Gaza, I think, you know, in some quarters it's understood that this current ceasefire, Trump's 20-point plan, has sort of kind of gone around the UN, so to speak, and demonstrated how multilateralism has failed. I think it's important to understand all the multilateral international action that happened around the United Nations before this current ceasefire agreement, in particular the initiative by the French and the Saudis in the General Assembly that helped to bring the two-state solution kind of back into discussion. Not that long ago, it was really kind of seen as essentially dead. So that was an important role for the United Nations fora that I do think helped to prepare the ground for this. And then, of course, it's on the humanitarian side that the UN has been extremely important in that issue. Yeah.
It's interesting to hear you describe it that way, the current security situation, because it sounds a lot like the Cold War, where the Security Council would sort of drop out of dealing with the major violence and wars of the time because one of the great powers was a participant and used the veto. It sort of seems same as it ever was, and proves the talking heads were right once again. I think we have occasion to have questions from the audience as well. So I'll invite folks to join that process if they wish. There's a microphone to circulate.
Thank you very much. My name is Jared. So my question has to do with the budget and kind of the vision that you spoke to about FDR, of what he would think of the United Nations today. The last figures that I saw estimated the overall budget for the UN is around $10 billion a year, and the United States contributes, or is expected to contribute, around 23% of that. To what extent did FDR envision the United Nations depending so heavily on a single nation, in this case particularly the United States, for its funding, leadership, and overall vitality? And how might the organization's evolution amid widening global wealth and income disparities challenge or contradict the multilateral spirit that FDR originally imagined?
Well, that's an interesting question. I would answer in part by saying a couple of things. First of all, the Security Council itself, it's easy to forget that in World War II, there was an organization, for example, based in New York called the Society for the Prevention of World War III. And growing up in the Cold War, we automatically think they're referring to the Soviet Union. But in fact, it was about Germany. And we tend to forget that the whole concept of the Security Council and the very important relationship with Russia was the fear of resurgent Germany. And actually, it is Germany that is the starting place of the Cold War. It's much like Ukraine. It's the U.S. and Western decision to revitalize the West German economy in 1946 that leads to the Berlin blockade and all the tensions that eventually erupted that really crystallized into this divided Europe between East and West. So, again, I think from Roosevelt's perspective, he was suspicious of the Russians, so were the chiefs of staff, but they also understood that they needed Russia and the post-war period. It was going to be very important, and of course, getting into a war with Russia was to be avoided. That, I think, helps explain the notion of you need these 4 policemen, or 5 policemen ultimately. And that was the idea that they would continue to cooperate to try to maintain the peace in the world by working together. The veto was a complicated business that was a compromise that both the United States and I think the Soviet Union felt they needed for political reasons. Well, in Roosevelt's case, for political reasons. Stalin, because he just insisted on it. In terms of the budget, I'm not sure that, I think Roosevelt, I think that question of what kind of financial support was something that obviously he would be in favor of the United States playing a major role. Certainly that was the case with the Bretton Woods Accords and that were signed in 1944 and moving forward. Whether or not he would have recognized a percentage or what have you, I'm not sure that I've never seen anything which indicated an actual financial number. It may be out there, and maybe it's something I just missed. But one thing that is interesting is he was very much in favor of Brazil being on the Security Council and being one of the permanent members, but was kind of talked out of that near the end of his life. And that did come up in the early days at San Francisco, which is kind of a shame because that would have been an interesting dimension to add to the UN. But I'm not aware of you know, I think he really wanted to create this, what he called the family of nations. And they believe me, they understood the disparities. They understood, and in fact, they were all convinced if they didn't allow people to air their grievances publicly in front of those great powers in Security Council, there wouldn't be a United Nations. That Stalin basically had to understand that. Without that concession, people would say this is a joke. So they were quite aware of that disparity. But again, on the budget question, I'm not sure.
Oh, the budget. For UN nerds, it's a big topic of conversation right now, because it's really in a bad state. But just real quickly, it's important to understand, right, that so that $10 billion budget figure, that I think is coming from when you talk about the UN budget, you really talk about it in three buckets: the regular budget, the peacekeeping budget, and then the voluntary budget, which is quite large. The 10 billion is the regular budget, and the peacekeeping budget, which are funded by assessed contributions. That is, just by being a member of the United Nations, you have an assessment based upon the size of your economy about how much you need to contribute, and that's figured out every year in the Fifth Committee in the General Assembly. So every voting member of the General Assembly contributes. And yeah, that's right, between 22 and 26%, depending upon the thing the U.S. contributes, which, by the way, is only the assessed contributions, and the voluntary contributions of the U.S. represents about 0.06% of the U.S. budget. It's very interesting, your question about does this challenge the multilateral element of the organization. I would say the assessed contribution model actually encourages multilateralism, right? It provides general funds to the organization that are used for international cooperation. The issue is that because of the way that the budget is now being fought over, not just by the US, but also China, is that the share of the voluntary funding is going up. Member states are, the US and China in particular, but even also Brazil, is delaying payments and playing with the assessed contributions in order to get more of the kinds of programs they want, as opposed to just saying, I'm a member of the United Nations, here's your money, and this is what you do. The Chinese in particular manipulate the budget conversations quite a bit to undermine human rights. It's well established, and it seems that the U.S. is currently kind of starting to engage in that kind of thing. You asked, is the U.S. engaged still in the UN? Yes, it is, but it's doing it in more sort of, we want to pick and choose what we fund, and that's where it can undermine actually the multilateral international cooperative spirit of the United Nations.
Thank you. I think we have probably time for one more question.
Fascinating conversation. I was sort of, I've got this lingering minefield question in the back of my mind. Two really interesting points, the map and how it's centered over the North Pole. I never noticed. That really does leave out the global South. But for the fact that it was drawn up to pull us out of ethnocentrism is interesting to me. Is this whole debacle a shift in hegemonic forces? And yes, I'm using that old Gramscian leftist term, but haven't we really benefited from manufacturing, consuming, highest GDP, which all feeds into the largest occupying military in the world since World War II? And are we really just seeing, I guess let me focus the question, from a diplomatic, from a historical, and from a poli-sci level, has there ever been a large hegemonic force be reshuffled in the world order and do it gracefully?
Well, the question is looking for gracefulness in world political history. Can you help?
To the historian.
I don't know. Yeah, I mean, I think your question sort of answers itself in a way. I mean, when you think about the Pax Britannica, the 19th century, that if you see the First World War as bringing that to an end, and then you have this period of a multipolar world that we saw in the 1930s, there has been, and serious historians have made this argument, that having a hegemonic power sometimes leads to a long period of peace. And peace is relative, I mean in the sense that you don't have major wars. And the 19th century, from 1814, the Concert of Europe, the Vienna Congress, up to 1914 is often seen as this kind of period where Britain was sort of the, it was the global power. But aside from the Crimean War, and then obviously you have the Boer War and the Spanish-American War and so forth, you had some smaller conflicts around the world. But in general, it was a period of relative peace that then disintegrated in 1914. So my short answer to your question is it doesn't really look like it, does it? Which is kind of a scary thought if that's what's happening right now, if the United States is now devolving from this position of global hegemony.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the world sees it that way, very specifically, and I think in particular, and it's not just the U.S., it's also Russia, for quite dramatically, I think that in terms of the interest in how to change the organization, I think a lot of the conversation is trying to understand how the organization can change, not just simply by kind of fixing the broken parts or trying to readjust it, but actually to adapt it to a new reality. And that's kind of where the economic power argument that I was speaking to earlier. I mean, certainly from the African perspective, they say we weren't at that table. We weren't. Not only were we not at Yalta, they weren't even really at the San Francisco conference. So this order was created without their input, and that's a major slice of the global population and a big slice of the population to come. I mean, the youth population is there. So yes, it's about shifting geopolitics, shifting order, and how to navigate that elegantly, as you said.
Well, thank you for the questions. Thank you for being here, and join me in thanking our presenters, Adam and David. Thanks so much, guys. Super interesting.